Bienvenidas, bienvenidos a los Diálogos de Derecho Internacional 2021 de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Itela. Mi nombre es Alejandro Chehtman, soy profesor de Derecho Internacional de la carrera de abogacía de la Escuela de Derecho de Itela y director de la carrera de abogacía. I will now switch into English. I am delighted to welcome so many fantastic colleagues and friends, both panelists and presenters and participants, and so much miss being able to do this in person. Today we have a superb program on international law and violence. That is, we will discuss how violence is thematized, addressed, tamed, or even perhaps favored by international law. I cannot think of a better way to launch this conversation than with our keynote speaker today, Professor Sam Moyn. Samuel Moyn is Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at the University of Yale. He has written a number of path-breaking books, including the superb Not Enough: Human Rights in an Unequal World in 2018. And he's not only one of the most influential thinkers on international law today, but also one of the kindest, more down-to-earth and generous colleagues you will ever find. Today, he will speak about the paradoxes of humane war, which will provide us with a glimpse, I think, of his fascinating book, Humane, which is forthcoming in the next couple of weeks. The idea is that this will work more like a seminar and not a webinar, so you're all welcome to participate, ask questions. Sam will speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. In order to make your question, you need to simply raise your digital hand or drop me a line through the chat, and I will keep the queue for all of you to participate. Sam, thanks so much for being with us today. I'm thrilled. It's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, to Alejandro, and thanks to everyone for coming. I have to apologize at the start. This is also the first day of my school term here in the United States, and my own class is meeting not long from now. So I'm going to attempt to hear as much as I can of the rest, but I'm very apologetic that I can't stay the whole time. It's a huge opportunity for me to oh no, it's not letting me share the screen. To talk about this new book. It's saying I have to allow Zoom to share the screen. So let me see if I can quickly do that. Apologies, I don't know why this is happening. This is a book that is really about US history and directed towards an American situation, and yet I hope it's relevant to others from outside. And so I think I may have succeeded. Let's see. Do you see my screen or no?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So, I haven't figured out exactly how to talk about this book, but I'm going to only talk about the very first pages or chapter and imply in my limited time how the arguments might connect to the more recent period and the intervening time in between the 19th century and the present. I start then, and I start with this gentleman on the screen, Lev Tolstoy, great novelist, because he was present at the creation, if not of international humanitarian law, so-called, then of the first attempt through formal treaty to diminish suffering in war. And that is a project that has taken hold in recent years. And yet from the beginning, Tolstoy voiced some reservations about the project. I don't think they were applicable for a long time, indeed for most of the 20th century. But with respect to American war, and maybe great power war generally, Tolstoy was a prophet and the concerns he anticipated about humane war are, I believe, to some extent live now, and we should face them. So I'll just narrate a couple of stages of his thinking, and I'm going to emphasize not just how prescient he was. He was the first in a long line of critics of the project of humanizing law, of the first David Kennedy, you might say, if you're following international legal debate. But I want to emphasize even more specifically that he pioneered some thinking about exactly how the risks of humane war accrue that no one has reached even through our day. And so he justifies our continuing attention. As you may know, Tolstoy was an aristocrat. Before he was a famous novelist, he went to war himself in the Crimean War and was present at the siege of Sevastopol, one of the landmark events in that war. And writing some sketches on the events, he gained his first renown in Russia as a stylist. Fascinatingly, in these first sketches, he broaches what seems to be a critique of the project of making war humane, not yet in the 1850s through international law. He's present when the generals on both sides, at the top of the walls of the city and those bombarding it from without, decide to have a truce in view of the fact that there are a lot of dead bodies strewn around and wounded men bleeding out. And they pause to collect them. And Tolstoy's narrator, although this is purely a choice on the part of the generals, not legally compelled by any means, even by national rules, let alone international ones, Tolstoy's narrator is caustic. What's the meaning, he asks, of the fact that these are Christians who pause in death dealing as if this moment of humanity would make it better? What's the hypocrisy involved in diminishing suffering and going on killing? Now, that's a very, let's call it honestly, sophomoric critique. I think it's worth considering, and probably in our classes, if we talk about IHL, we raise it from the first. But it seems clear that it's worth diminishing suffering in a world of ongoing war. In War and Peace, Tolstoy has one of his most famous characters get edgier and propound a thesis that I want to say in advance, I think is false, but provocative. Prince Andrei, one of the two, let's say, main characters of the classic novel, the night before, actually, he's mortally wounded himself in the great Battle of Borodino, says, if I were in charge, I would not take prisoners. And then he says, at least in the translation I prefer, they talk of the laws of warfare and humanity to the wounded and so on. That's all rubbish. Now, I don't think this has been noted in the commentary on Tolstoy, but this could be conceivably a direct reference to the initiation of IHL, at least in the most mythological accounts, the Geneva Convention of 1864, which came about when Tolstoy was revising War and Peace for publication. But either way, whether or not Tolstoy knew of the Geneva Convention, which was obviously about humanity to the wounded, precisely, allowing non-governmental forces to succor the wounded in battle of the kind that the Red Cross's founder, Henri Dunant, had witnessed at Solferino. famously. Prince Andrei rejects it and says, this project of making war humane is a mistake. And in fact, it would be better if we didn't make it more humane, even ruling out the prohibition of quarter, which didn't exist under the law yet. It would come to exist under later international law. Now, for us, the question is, what's his rationale for this now outrageous statement, which is essentially endorsing war crimes, as you and I would rightly see it? Well, I think this is where Andrei and I think Tolstoy go wrong, because there's a causal claim that leaving war brutal would make it less cruel. Now, interestingly, the standard of evaluation is the same on both sides of the argument, diminishing cruelty, at this point, at least for Tolstoy. But there's some kind of empirical conjecture that being less cruel in war would make war happen less often. Now, this was not just his own conjecture. If we look at Karl von Clausewitz, and indeed his disciple in America, the founder sometimes said of the laws of war, Francis Lieber, they both conjectured that leaving war brutal would make war shorter when it comes. Not that it would be less common, but however common it is, it would be less shorter. But either way, they're all in a universe of, first of all, empirical conjecture and causal supposition at this point. And it's interesting, but many of us would think it's crazy that these empirical conjectures don't make a lot of sense. Obviously, we can imagine brutal wars that happen frequently, and we can imagine brutal wars, maybe that's what we think is still happening, that go on and on and on. And so it's hard to figure out how you would make Prince Andrei's argument for him, since he just makes it in passing. I do think there's something to these arguments, but I think we have to recast them. The suggestion of Clausewitz and Lieber on the one hand, and Prince Andrei on the other, is that there are good effects of what they acknowledge is a bad cause, brutality. What if that's implausible, but it's still credible that the good cause of making war humane has some potentially perverse effects, or at least risks that we ought to conceptualize and control, either leading to the ease of resort to force because it seems less big a deal, or its entrenchment once it starts. So humane and endless war. And that's what I want to focus on, because Tolstoy eventually did, flirting with elaborating the hypothesis that humanity will entrench violent corporal practices. Now, before we proceed to his argument, let's consider the reverse of all of these three figures I've mentioned, Clausewitz, Lieber, and Tolstoy, at least in this stage of War and Peace of his trajectory. On the screen, you have, let's say, the real, founder and longtime leader of the Red Cross, Dunant's fellow Swiss, much less famous, I believe, much more important gentleman, Gustave Moynier. At a certain point in one of his funding speeches, he offers the reverse empirical conjecture as the other three. He says, this Geneva Convention, which is the treaty that allows non-governmental forces to take care of soldiers when governments don't, is a foot in the door for humanity, and it can't help but ally humanization of war to pacification. of humanity. It's like a stepping stone or first rung, or a slippery slope in a good way, showing some regard for suffering, anticipates a time when their common humanity will lead them to understand that the very idea of killing in war is monstrous. The humanization, his word is civilisation, of war could only lead to its abolition. Now, I just want to note that this is the same. It's an empirical conjecture. It's a causal supposition of some kind. X leads to Y, can only lead, and it's got to be wrong. I mean, it seems very dubious to me because we've had a lot of humanization of war, and it's not obvious why we would think that it's reduced war. Maybe other things have reduced war, but it's not clear that humanization has. So we're dealing with a bunch of figures so far in the little talk who have, let's call them, not very credible, at least not substantiated empirical conjectures, which are related to some causal pathways in which reform would lead to outcomes. Okay, so I just want to note in passing, just because I am proud of this small empirical finding, that Moyn actually, in one of his obscure German articles, anticipated a possibility or envisaged an eventuality in which the laws of war he was promoting and which he thought were humanizing in spirit beyond the Geneva Convention could have the outcome of entrenching war. And he said, if that ever happened, I would give up the Red Cross. It's just not time, because as of now, it's not credible to me that I'm abetting endless war by making it more humane. But it's striking that Moyn, the chief apostle of humane war, really, at least before the 20th century, says this could happen. And if it did, I would change my mind. Well, Tolstoy, I think, as he evolved past the 1850s and 60s, thought harder about this topic. As you probably know, he came near to giving up fiction when he converted to his own private Christianity and made up his own religion, you might say, in response to some American Christians who he liked to read, and in response to a particular line in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, his broader framework, which led him to pacifism and vegetarianism, which will matter, as we'll see, was not consequentialist in the way that everyone I've talked about so far is. A violent act is wrong, no matter on this theory whether it has good or bad outcomes. It's just wrong in itself because we're not supposed to do evil. We're not even supposed to resist evil on this framework. And yet, I want to suggest some consequentialist reasoning and even empirical conjecture remained in Tolstoy's mature thought about war. And it's that I want to explore, that I think is the unprecedented part of his work that even goes beyond more recent critics like David Kennedy of humane war. Because what Tolstoy did in his mature work is compare the humanization of war to two fundamental parallels. The goal was to motivate skepticism. And the first was chattel slavery, and the second was the slaughter of non-human animals for food. And what I want to emphasize just in my remaining time before I say just a tiny bit about why this matters now is that Tolstoy was focusing intently on agents and mechanisms in a causal pathway in order, if not to prove, then at least to raise our confidence in the empirical conjecture that making a corporal practice more humane could entrench it and at least leads to a risk that ought to be considered and controlled. So let's examine these two. So the first comparison I said Tolstoy indulges is with the past of the regulation of the violent corporal practice of chattel slavery. There had been tons of law about slavery before there was an abolitionist movement, and it was known as amelioration law. It basically said, you get your right to private property in human beings, but it's not unlimited. And there are legal constraints on cruelty towards your property. This was, as I say, known as an amelioration law. And Tolstoy's critique is, to the extent that this reform of humanizing slavery risked entrenching it, it ran an enormous risk. And there might have been an alternative, either immediately or sooner, had abolition been embraced sooner, either in the alternative to or alongside humanization. And there's actually some reason to think, according to some historians, that he was right. One of the great African-American historians who studied amelioration says that's right. I mean, he didn't know Tolstoy anticipated him, but he studied amelioration and said, actually, the humanization of slavery did entrench it. And the risk of entrenchment through humanizing a violent corporal practice was incurred in that case. And Tolstoy's simple question is, if that's true, how do we know we're not incurring it again when it comes to humanizing war? And if we are, what do we do? Now, note that this argument by no means implies that we should give up humanization. It only sensitizes us to a risk we should see and decide what to do with, maybe in the name of controlling it. Now the brilliance of Tolstoy's argument in this regard, I think, is that he establishes an even more specific causal pathway, which is what I want to call the advocate's compromise. He says, look what happens if you're a reformer who chooses to bracket abolitionism, because then you can't work with slaveholders, and you enter a compromise with them around humanizing their slavery. And the claim is that this is when good people who are trying to engage in reform end up incurring a risk through compromise. And what's, I think, very insightful about this is that we know it applies at least to the strategic logic of IHL, which is state-made law, in which there may be reformers out there pressing states to live up to their obligations, reinterpreting the obligations so that they're tougher, but involves strategic compromise with the state in general and the military in particular, not over whether to have war, but how to conduct it. And this is an exact parallel. Now, the fact that there is this parallel doesn't mean that it has a lot of significance ethically. I think it does. Tolstoy thought it does, but there could be, just as Moyn predicted, a possibility that compromise actually leads to the abolition of the violent corporal practices more quickly than a direct attack on it might. Or maybe abolition is not possible for the time being, and humanization makes it more likely in some medium or long term. Maybe the situation as after 9/11 is one in which it's very difficult to criticize war, and yet we can delegitimate the war itself by criticizing the way it's conducted And so there's a kind of covert abolitionism in the very attempt to call for humanization of it. All that's possible, but it's also possible, and I think Tolstoy was absolutely correct to signal this, that it could be that humanization entrenches, that it did so in the slavery case, that it could do so in the case of war, and that it did do so in the case of American war after 9/11. Okay, so let's turn quickly to a second fundamental comparison, which is a comparison with the case of non-human animal slaughter. Now, fascinatingly, already in his middle phase when he wrote War and Peace, he has Prince Andrei introduce this comparison and say that making war humane is a lot like regulating animal slaughter. And it's like the case of a woman who hates the fact that her meat is killed cruelly, but eats it anyway. Now, this is fascinating, and it turns out that after it became a vegetarian, Tolstoy kept this theme alive and visiting one of the first modern slaughterhouses near his aristocratic estate, where they were promising less cruel slaughter. And he uses the same gendered metaphor, that the trouble is that there may be people who, in response to the possibility of humanizing the killing in their name or for their sake, think they're better or good enough morally, even though they're conducting a terrible thing, a terrible act, which would be the killing of the animal itself. Note that in that, little manifesto about vegetarianism, Tolstoy says the trouble with this actor is that she eats her meat on condition it's not killed cruelly, with full assurance that she is doing right. Now, I want to propose that this is a second causal pathway. Let's call this one, in contrast to the advocate's compromise, the beneficiary's bad faith. And the basic idea is this: if I've supported a humanization of a violent corporal practice with which I'm complicit, even if I'm just in the audience or somewhere at long down the chain of consumers, I'm a good enough person, even though it's not as if this means the death itself of the animal doesn't happen. In fact, maybe more animals can now be killed because the moral scrutiny that would otherwise attach to the violent corporal practice has been cosmetically changed for the better. And again, Tolstoy's claim is this is a moral error on its own, that you would think you're a good person if you've, demanded your meat be slaughtered more humanely or your war be conducted more humanely. But it's especially bad if that bad faith has an empirical effect, namely the effect of entrenching the war. I think this is a really good, set of claims by Tolstoy, because it's clear in my mind, at least. I mean, I'm not as sure this slavery stuff works, but here, it doesn't seem like we can say in world historical view, like looking at Argentina or elsewhere where lots of meat continues to be raised and eaten, that the global humanization of slaughter of non-human animals has led to less consumption. Seems like, if anything, it's led to more. And if there's an abolitionist movement with respect to killing animals, it doesn't seem like it's come out of, as Gustave Moynier might have predicted, the humanization process. It's an alternative to it. Okay, so let me conclude, since I've got maybe 5 more minutes, with some thoughts. I think this is all completely applicable to the war on terror conducted by my country and its allies, especially in a phase in which the heavy footprint interventions of the years immediately after 9/11, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, gave way to a new form of war, not heavy footprint, but light and no footprint, with special forces used more year on year with small teams of men paying a little visit rather than occupying a country. And of course, the rise of armed drones, as well as the use of standoff missiles, which we know has been a significant phenomenon in our world. I think this did not come out of nowhere. And what I try to do in the book Humane is tell a story of how Tolstoy's initially, I think, inapplicable worries have become very applicable in our own day. Just to make a long story short, let me talk about 4 stages. I think the Geneva Convention of 1864 was unrepresentative of the laws of war for a long time. That the balance of the laws of war, not just through the 19th century, but through most of the 20th, if we look at it, it was not humane in content. And was actually not just permissive, but incredibly brutal. And not because it failed, but because that's what states wanted it to be, in a sense, then because it succeeded. Even then, it was highly exclusionary insofar as the laws of war allowed lots of wars, especially counterinsurgent wars outside the North Atlantic, although not always outside, to be treated as law-free. And then even when there was humane content, in most conflicts we can think about through the Cold War, it was basically ignored. So for this trinity of reasons, I think Tolstoy was too early. The law of war wasn't applied or even envisioned in a humane manner until something else happened. And I believe it was in the 1970s when first the additional protocols take a quantum leap, I believe, largely because of new folks in the room after decolonization in the direction of a genuine humanization of the laws of war in content. But then we also get new developments both in civil society and the military. In my country, after Vietnam, when there's a declining anti-war movement, but a rising humanitarian movement, notably groups like Human Rights Watch, which begin abstaining from thinking about the legality of the initiation or continuation of war, but monitor the legality of its conduct under so-called IHL, called that from the 60s and 70s. The military self-humanizes, which I think is totally unprecedented in the history of any powerful country before our time. If you want, we could talk later about human rights law and the way it comes to intersect at various points, and really in our time. The Gulf War was utterly critical after the Cold War when this situation crystallizes, among other things, because it's the first time both Human Rights Watch monitors an international war for compliance with international humanitarian law, and the first war in which military lawyers are involved in picking targets, which we know will have, define American war, including drone war today. Lastly, consider what happened after 9/11. Notwithstanding a little bit of anti-war activism, nothing like what happened in American history, and especially during Vietnam, the major debates about American war have regarded its conduct, its humanity. First, there was the torture debate from roughly 2004 through 6, really the critical period in which, far from ending the war on terror, an emphasis on IHL led the bug of brutality to be taken out of the program of Americans' endless war, and therefore entrench and help legitimate it in precisely the way that Tolstoy feared. And then you have the presidency of Barack Obama, capitalizing on a promise to fight humanely, as Obama did on many occasions, notably in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech and in his speech at the National Defense University, explaining the morality of drone warfare, which emphasized its legality under international standards. And Obama's genius was to understand that the move from one form of, let's call it, brutal, obsolete war that even Bush had conducted and which caused his presidency to become so unpopular, could be replaced by a new form, a more humane form, and one that became more legitimate in consequence for enough people, that advocates urged through compromise, that audiences accepted through bad faith, and which shows no signs of ending even today. So I'll stop there. I've tried to lay out Tolstoy's worries about humane war and just gesture at the possibility that they define how we might think about at least some kinds of war today and lead us to, think more critically about international humanitarian law, so-called, in our time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. So open to questions. I'm not going to abuse my privileges as chair. So yes, Noam. Noam Samir, I think I saw your hand, maybe. So Pablo then?
It wasn't my hand, but I'm actually happy
Okay.
to jump on this opportunity to ask.
Okay, go ahead, and then Pablo and Alexandra.
So thank you for really fascinating presentation. I have a follow-up question on the argument that before the additional protocols, you stated that war was not really humane. And I was just hoping that you could tell us a bit more about it, because at least if you look at the text of the ICRC, when they write, the commentary to the additional protocol 1 and the basic rules of distinction between the civilian population and the belligerent participators, they say these rules were all based on customary international law, and they refer to the Hague regulations at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's really one point that I would like to hear more from you. And the second point, which is of course connected, you stated, well, there are different factors behind the additional, or powers behind the additional protocols, and you referred to the new guys in the block. So again, also to hear a bit more about that, because those wars and the new guys in the block, I didn't necessarily think of them as the new barriers of human rights or humane regimes. So two related questions. Thank you.
Alejandro, should I just answer, or you're not? Okay. Thank you so much, Noam. Those are both wonderful questions. I do try to give a little bit of attention, especially to the first, and I'll try to answer the second too. So, I refer you to, I think, a genuine masterpiece on this topic by an Australian scholar named Amanda Alexander, who's written an article called The Short History of International Humanitarian Law. And I follow her, and I try to expand her account in making the point that what goes on in the 70s is a reinvention of tradition, because what it's very tempting to do when you want to make a change in the world, and you actually succeed, as Jean Pictet and others did in getting the additional protocols passed, is to claim that they say nothing new. But of course they did say a lot that was new. And we can debate the place of customary international law in the past in general, and in this domain in particular. But I think that while some of the ideas in the additional protocols, especially the explicit distinction rule, unstated before, are old, I don't think they were broadly accepted by states, certainly not by the criteria with which we associate CIL, general and consistent practice of states, accepted as law. It's just not true that they ever were. And even more, I think, is that true of the requirement of proportionality. I don't think we have a good history of that principle, but it's not very old. And indeed, it's not, technically even in the additional protocols, but is quickly associated with it. So, my own view is that we should, not just take at face value the claim of actors that they're doing nothing new, because that's what you say when you are. More than that, I think we can just look back at like what goes on in the making of the Hague Regulations, which I do in detail, and the Geneva Conventions in the 40s, and try to figure out, well, what commitment to humanity was there actually in the text and in the early interpretation by states? And to what extent was there consciousness of these new provisions? Now, I will say, this is a criticism I would make in my own account, that when it comes to prisoner treatment, there are major steps forward in the later 19th and early 20th century. It just turns out that in the early 21st, those very concerns allow humanity to be invoked even as America is refusing to capture anyone else in order to kill them instead. That's what Obama did. And yet there's some evidence for humane content before the 70s. I just think it's largely restricted to some targeting and of particular kinds of places, but especially to the treatment of prisoners. Okay, your second question is fantastic. I would say the main agenda of the new states was to change the theory of just war, so that war is licit when it's anti-imperial and illicit when it's imperial. That was their main agenda, and it's reflected most notably, I think, in the Declaration on Friendly Relations. And so it was on the jus ad bellum side. But we can't deny that they also did a lot of work in humanizing the laws of war. Now, there's a proviso there, of course, which is that they're very interested in new respect for freedom fighters who would have been branded terrorists beyond the protection of the law under the prior regime. And even more, I would point to the fact that they had their allies in the international system, not just the communists, but even Western Europeans. Because what's really significant about the 1970s is not just that America has lost Vietnam and its own stewards are willing to deal and engage with the making of IHL. I narrate this in the book, but maybe even more important, West Europeans aren't fighting brutal wars anymore, with the lone exception of the Portuguese, who are losing their empire at this very time. And so if you have a new geopolitical situation in which West Europeans are allowing Americans to do their dirty work, but cultivating the reputation of morally superior actors, you have a situation in which is geopolitically new. The old imperialists helped the new states humanize the laws of war. That's my account. It's a great question, and it requires a lot of research, a lot of which is happening. I just didn't do it for this book.
Thanks. Pablo?
Thanks, Alejandro, and thank you, Sam, for a really great talk and really suggestive. And also, I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about Moyn and in particular this awareness that you presented of Moyn having about humanization having two potential outcomes. One is pacifism or the abolition of war, and the other would be something like endless war. And in my reading of Moyn, he really emphasized the first, right? And as you said in your talk, the second, the risk of endless war was more, less easy to find and more in a sort of hidden writings. You were saying that the humanitarian aspect of the loss of war is really happens with the quantum leap of the additional protocols, but this really sheds maybe I will say damning light on the late 19th century humanitarians, right? That they were really interested in codifying the loss of war. They thought that codification could help their cause of making the war humane, but in your reading that didn't really happen. So I was wondering, just to use the language of your talk, if we can attribute to Moyn some sort of bad faith as well, maybe also to the humanitarians of the late 19th century, and maybe also to the members of the Institut de Droit International. They thought they were doing a good thing, right? They thought they were being a civilizing force. So I wonder if they should have known better, or they could know better. Were they disingenuous? And perhaps specifically, I remember reading these really fascinating passages in a draft of your book on the relationship between these humanitarians and the pacifists of the late 19th century. And I was hoping you could maybe tell us a little bit about that relationship between humanitarianism and pacifism on the eve of the Hague Conventions. But really, how should we read Moyn and these founding fathers of humanitarianism? Were they, acting on bad faith? Were they just too under the spell of the idea of progress and civilization? If you could tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Sam,
Thank
do you
you
mind
so
if we
much,
collect
Pablo.
another question? So
Of
Alexandra
course, yeah.
Okay, so Alexandra, and then you have time for both of them.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Sam, for that presentation. It actually caused me to rethink what I'm doing in my own paper, which I'll get to. So I think that just goes to show how thought-provoking I thought your presentation was. So I'm not at all an IHL lawyer, but there is something I always wondered is, what does humanization mean in the context of war? Because from my perspective, war is the most inhumane thing, really. I mean, just killing is inhumane. And then so we're trying to humanize it. And it seems, I don't know. So it's a really basic question maybe, but it's kind of like, it's like we can't, we don't think we're not capable of killing. So then we try to somehow humanize it. So I'm just wondering about that. And then when you talked about Obama's speech on, humane wars, my mind immediately went to drone warfare, and then you started talking about that, and then it went. So maybe you mentioned this and I missed it, because I just find it so ironic that Obama would use drones and claim that that's being humane, because then there's this album, I don't know if you know it, by Muse called Psycho, and Muse is basically talking about how inhumane drones are, and it's basically. It's kind of funny because they dehumanize warfare by creating this distance, but at the same time that comes at the cost of the humanity of the person that's behind the screen and sort of like pushing the button that pulls the trigger. And so I wonder, you're making it humane, but perhaps viewed from the attacker's perspective, but still, like, the person's treated like a robot and there's created this distance. So I don't know it's a comment I had, a thought that came to my mind, and I just wondered that if you have anything to respond to that. Thank you.
Excellent. I mean, they're both really essential questions. So thanks to you both. One is more kind of deep in the professional literature, and the other is more, directed to us as moral beings and citizens, and so I want to work at both registers. So, I mean, Pablo, I came away very disappointed by Gustave Moyn. Even if we leave out his, professional relation to Leopold's Belgian Empire, which I, chronicle and I don't think has been fully explored. There are these really tough questions about his own self-understanding. And I don't know how to answer your question. I did, as you suggest, think it's pretty amazing that along with his general story that this couldn't but help, that humanization would necessarily lead to pacification, there was this moment. And he wrote it down when he said, wait, if humanization led to more war, however humane, I would have to rethink my project, which seems like the most creditable moment in his whole career. Whether he was more deeply confused, I don't know, because I think when we look honestly, it turns out that the claims that he and others made that the codified laws of war were humane beyond the First Geneva Convention seem just, absurd. And I would apply that to those who made similar claims coming out of the Institute. Now, were they deluded? All of us, are sometimes deluded, sometimes hypocrites. And I don't know what the evidence is to figure out in retrospect which. Or for you and me, since we're both, deluded with respect to some things and hypocritical with respect to others, it's very hard to figure out what evidence would prove either case. Again, we could offer the explanation that, to keep enthusiasm alive amongst funders, especially, you don't want to say, look, we've been co-opted by the military, even if you have. And I think today that there's still a lot of that going on. There's an awareness amongst even, the most starry-eyed, reformers in the IHL world that this is a raw deal. But if they see no alternatives, you work with what you have, between apology and the lesser utopia of the laws of war. And I think Moyn was probably already in that situation, but we can't penetrate. Okay, Alexandra, I sympathize with the view that the idea of humane war is the idea of an oxymoron. On the other hand, somehow we're not reckoning with our situation if we don't acknowledge that war can be made different through mobilization and regulation, including international legal regulation. And I'm very sympathetic with the idea that asymmetric warfare is humane principally for those conducting it, but it would be false to say that the victims aren't better off under our current regime of legalized asymmetry, which requires some forbearance, like in cases where you predict that you're going to inflict disproportionate harm with a drone or a standoff missile. Now, you might say, we should keep our attention on the residual inhumanity of war, no matter what. And I agree. But somehow, if we don't reckon with this reform project, which has achieved something, which has made it better to be, a goat herder out in, the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan than it was to be a rice farmer in Vietnam, or, earlier counterinsurgencies conducted by America or Europeans. If we don't acknowledge that, then we don't know how to engage with precisely the people who need to be told, not only is your war not humane enough, but the very fact that you've made it more humane has entrenched it, or that you've not controlled the risks that it has. So that's my argument, but it does require me to, let's say, grant what we all know, that law can have effects in the world. And my trouble is that it's had less effects on keeping war in bounds than on humanizing its conduct.
Excellent. Francisco Quintana has a question now, I believe.
Yes, thank you very much, Alejandro. And thank you very much, Professor Moyn. This was wonderful. I very much look forward to reading the book. So very broadly, on the point you just ended, which is the war on terror. So if it's not too much of a counterfactual question, to start, my question is whether the use at bellum could have been more helpful to resist the war on terror. And even so, I'm interested in how the displacement of the use at bellum became possible and legitimate in international law or in legal arguments. So more concretely, I am concerned about a particular approach to legal argument. So the formalizing approach to international humanitarian law that became particularly prominent in US academic and political circles. So this blending of IHL, use at bellum constitutional law under the label of national security law. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the role of this in the production of endless war, perhaps as a particularly problematic approach to IHL.
It's a fantastic question and good to see you. You know, displacement is a big word, and again, it would require empirical proof to say that it's happened, you know, because as you suggest, it's counterfactual. Maybe if there had been less attention or a different kind of attention to IHL, the wars would have happened anyway. We do know that not only in response to the Iraq intervention, but even earlier in response to the Afghan intervention, there were some who decried their illegality under the UN Charter. Now, do I imagine that there was a possibility that the United States didn't intervene in Afghanistan in 2001? It seems really unlikely. You know, we talk about in my country, well, what if Al Gore had been given the presidency by the Supreme Court rather than Bush? Well, we conclude that the war would have happened and we would still be dealing with what we're just dealing with today, you know, the end of 20 years of it. Iraq, I don't know. I mean, it does seem like an emphasis on the jus ad bellum not only was a bigger deal in 2002-3 internationally, it had big effects in a different legal culture like the United Kingdom, where, you know, Tony Blair got in serious trouble legally. Whereas the absence of a culture of jus ad bellum, at least until very recently in American international law circles, I think provides it's not a counterfactual contrast because we have a contrast with the UK and the US there. I don't know. I mean, you know, my general argument is that we should want a culture in which we control the risk of entrenchment that humanization can bring, and therefore that national security law, so-called, which I reject, but international lawyering within the American superpower should be focused as much on or even more on the jus ad bellum than it has been of late. And I think a lot of people have learned their lesson on this. I think a lot more need to. And so I guess I'm not sure like whether it's useful to look back and say things could have been different, because as you suggest, who knows, but they could be different now. And indeed they are different. And I think we're at a moment of a crest, at least relative to, you know, American history, of anti-war sentiment. And what that means is that we must think differently about how privileged the IHL became in our moral armamentarium. Thanks so much. I've never seen a session end on such a high note and so on time. So I'm really grateful to all of you. Massive thanks to Sam for a tremendous opening session. And one of the good things, one of the few, very, very few good things about this situation we're all facing is that we can have people from so many different places coming in, and that's really great. So now we will make a 10-minute break for coffee and I don't know, just
freshen up a bit, and see you in 10 minutes for the first panel. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.